Alright, I want to do a series of videos here on basically how to take Forms data through Power Automate and save it into a SharePoint list. There are a number of reasons for doing this. I'm not going to get into kind of all of those reasons. I'll give you a couple of examples. And there are certainly other videos out there on this topic. Some of them are a little old and things are a little bit different these days, or they do things in a way that I don't particularly like. So this is my method for it, and I'm not saying it's the right way. It's certainly not the only way, but it's what I have found to be the most convenient for me and the way I work. Anyway, starting off, we're going to go through and talk a little bit about some prerequisites, so what we need to have in place. Now, first and foremost, I generally recommend, if you're setting up a process where you're going to be using this form to, indefinitely, use a group form. In another video somewhere, I talk about the pros and cons between group and personal forms. But the bottom line is, if you're building a business process and you want that process to to not be bound to or rely on one particular person remaining in your organization forever, then you want to use a group form, because that group form will be around as long as the group is, and your process won't break when the creator of the form leaves your organization. And let's be honest, that will happen in almost every case. So yeah, you'll want to use a group form. You'll want to design your form. Now, I'm not going to show you exactly how to do that. I assume that you already know or can watch Microsoft's trainings on how to do that. It's not difficult. It's pretty really intuitive. But again, you want to make sure that when you create that form, you create it as a group form or create it as a personal form, and then you can move it to a group. And then finally, we need to create the SharePoint list that's going to hold the data. And again, this is where using a group form makes a lot of sense, because that group, in addition to being able to create a group form, that group also has a SharePoint site. So you have a place to create that list that is going to be convenient for the people who need to see and work with the data to get to it. So that's kind of the general thing. These are the three steps that are fundamental to making this process work. Now, in terms of the response types and forms, there are, again, this is not a forms training, but just in the context of what we're talking about here today, it's important to understand what format the data comes in from that form into Power Automate. Most of the question types that you're going to use, so I think the most common question types on a form are short and long answer, text, probably more short answer than long answer, but either way, text, basically text entry, single select choice field, so you're giving users or responders a choice of 10 colors and asking them to pick one of them. And then date fields. Now, dates aren't used all that commonly, but you might be using a date field maybe if it's something like a request for a location or whatever it might be. So we'll cover dates as well. And then ranking questions. Not typically, I don't see these used a lot, but just know that the responses coming into the flow are going to be simply text. Other response types are not text, so, or at least not simple text. So an example of that is a multi-select choice response. So if it's a multi-select choice question where people can choose more than one option, the data is coming in as text, but it's got some formatting and some control characters in there, just by virtue of the format of the data that Forms uses to store that information. Other things like Likert scale. Likert scale is kind of an oddball, because this is the type of the matrix type question where you might have five aspects of, if it's an event feedback form, you might have 5 different aspects, like the venue, the speaker, the refreshments, etc. And then you ask people whether they they greatly enjoyed it or really hated it, and you're going to give them that range of choices. The interesting thing about those Likert scales is that each property, each characteristic, each aspect comes in as a separate response. So it's kind of like a meta question. It's a question that contains multiple other questions. And then we have file uploads, ratings, and net promoter scores, which all have their own unique characteristics. Now, today, just to keep this video kind of short and to the point, we're only going to cover kind of the 4 most common ones that I see. So short answer text, long answer text, single select choice, and date columns, or date questions rather. Now these all benefit from having a very direct correlation to a column type in SharePoint. So it's really easy when you're building that list to know what type of column to create for that question. Single line of text is a short answer text question. If it's a long answer text question, use multiple lines of text. Now technically there is a limit to that multiple lines of text column that is not there in the long answer text. So if you do have people who are going to be putting in very lengthy amounts of text in that long answer text, you'll probably want to rethink whether you even want to include that or how you go about including it, because my general suggestion is encourage people to not enter huge amounts of text. Even in the long answer text question or text response area, it's not a place to put 10 or 12 paragraphs worth of text. But single select choice, there's a choice column that by default only allows a single selection, and then date columns or date questions, there is a date field or date column type in SharePoint. So let's just take a look at first off the form that I have to work with. I just created this form to basically include one of every question type so that I had something to where I didn't have to keep creating new forms. So this just has one of everything, and I just kept the answers or the text of them very simple, like text question short answer, text long answer, etc., etc. But we've got 2 sections here, so the common or basic ones, which we're going to talk about today, and then the less common or more complex question types, which we'll deal with in future videos in this series. So now that I've got my form, I need to think about the list in SharePoint. Now, technically speaking, if it's a group form, there is an Excel spreadsheet that the responses automatically get written into. And technically, yes, you could use that Excel spreadsheet to generate the list, import that Excel sheet to create the list. But that does some odd things. Mainly, the naming of the columns is not entirely under your control, which I don't like. I'm kind of old school when it comes to SharePoint. I like keeping list names without spaces. I like keeping column names without spaces, and keeping things brief. So I like to be in control of how my lists get created. So I'm not a huge fan of that Excel import functionality. So what I'm going to do is just create this from scratch. It's pretty straightforward, pretty quick. We'll click New and select List, and I'll just select Blank List, and I'll just call this one of every question form. And so I type out the full name, and then I go back and remove the spaces, and then later on I can go back and reinsert those spaces. But the point is, when you're creating the list, whatever you put in here is going to be the URL or web address of that list. And so that is clean. It doesn't have any weird control characters, etc. But then I can basically come in here. Come on. I don't know why it is not letting me fix that, but it is not for some reason. Anyway, you can normally, under most circumstances, let me just do a refresh and see if that allows me. Oh, there we go. So basically click on that, and then I can insert the spaces to make it all pretty, and it's good, but the URL is still clean where I just have one of every question form. Blah. There we go. All right, so now we need to add our columns. Now, title is sometimes in these processes it's hard to figure out what that title should be. Should it be a question from your form? Should it be some other data from your form? I'm going to kind of put a pin in that. We'll come back to it later. But often what I do is kind of build something to put into that title, and it'll be something like form response from whoever responded on whatever date they responded. So you can come up with whatever format. Now the value in title doesn't need to be unique, it just needs to be populated in some way. It is a required field, in other words. But what I'm going to do is add another column here, and for our single or short text we'll just select text, which is a single line of text, and hit next, and then we'll call this short text. And now this is one of the places where you can leave spaces. You don't want to use other characters like dashes, underscores, parentheses, ampersands, etc. But letters, numbers, and spaces are okay, because when SharePoint creates this column, it's going to remove those spaces. However, what I often do, just for my own benefit, is I'll basically remove the spaces and just create, use what's called camel case, where you just capitalize the first word of each part of the name. So we'll call that short text with a capital S and a capital T, and hit save. And then you can go back, edit the column, and insert that space. Again, once you've created the column, the internal name is set, it's fixed. You can change this to whatever you want, and it will be fine because that internal name is still the same. So that's our short text. We'll add another one for the multiple lines, or the long text, which will be a multiple lines of text field. So I'll hit next and call this, you guessed it, long text. And I'm just going to skip renaming that for now. Choice, and we will call this single select choice, because later on we're going to create multi-select choice. And I'm just going to leave the same questions. Now, this is one point that is important to consider. The choice column that you're using here in SharePoint, the choice values really should match the choices in the form. So in this case, I've got choice 1, 2, 3. So I'm just going to go to my form and set these, instead of option, call this choice 1, choice 2, and choice 3. Just basically these choices should match the ones in the SharePoint list for your maintaining your own sanity. And then we'll add in a date question. So I'll add date and time. Now this allows you to create a date field or a date and time field. We're just going to use date right now. So I'll hit next and just call this date. And again, here it's date and time. If you want to include time, you can toggle that on, but I'm going to leave it off because there is no date and time question in a form. There is a way to kind of take the date, have a date field, and then have a separate question that asks for a time, and use those to build a date and time field in SharePoint. It's a little more advanced. It's something I don't generally recommend doing, just because it can be weird, it can be complicated, but it is possible. So if that's something you need to do, I may throw that in the comments below. I'll know that someone wants to do that, and I can record a video on how I've done that in the past. So hit save, and that's that. So those are just the 4 that we're going to start with. Now I need to go and build a flow. And this is where things can get a little more difficult, or not more difficult, but more complicated, because I'm going to create a new flow, and it'll be an automated cloud flow because I want to use the when a new response is submitted trigger, and I'll call this one of every question form to SharePoint. Very descriptive, and click create. Now that's going to let me basically ask me to pick my form, the form that I want to use. Now the problem is that I don't see one of every, I see one of every question type personal form, because I have a personal form with the same name. Actually it's one of every question type personal form is the name of the form. I created the other one with the same name but group form at the end to differentiate. But you'll see I don't see that. And basically that's just because that picker will not show you group form. So what you need to do is go to your form, and somewhere in this URL you will see something that says ID equals. Now this is not session ID, that's something different, but it just says ID equals, and whatever comes after that is the ID, actually up to that ampersand. So you're going to copy that, go back over to your flow, enter a custom value, and paste that in. That's it. Now the next step that we need to do is actually get the response data. So the trigger, basically all it does is say, hey, this form was, a response was submitted by this to this form by this person, and here's the ID number. It doesn't include the actual content, or it might include some of the content, but it doesn't include all of the content of that form response. At least it's not guaranteed to. So the first thing that I always do is add a get response details action, which is the only action available from the Forms connector. And again, for the form ID, we need to use that custom value and paste in that same form ID. And then the response ID is going to be the response ID that's returned by the trigger. And that's it. There we go. So now, based on that data, I want to add those items or create an item in the SharePoint list using that information. So what I need to do is look for the create item action. And where do I want to create it? What site? It'll be my escape planning site. It'll be the one of every question type, or one of every question form. That's the one I just created, not the one with the number 2 at the end there. Was from an earlier attempt. Ignore that. So basically that's it. And then it's going to bring up, basically show me the schema of that list. What columns are there, so I know what values I want to put in there. Now for the title, as I said, I like to, depending on the circumstance, depending on the list, what this is actually used for, it might be a column from your from the form response, or it might not. So what I'm going to do is basically just build a string here, and I'll say form response from, and here I can basically get the responder's email at, and then there is a submission time. So basically I'll say this form was responded, form response is from this person's email at this time, date and time. Now it is going to be in UTC, which is probably okay for our purposes, but again, you might that's another video for another time. All right, so short text, that is going to be our text question short answer. Long text is going to be text question long answer. See, this is not complicated. Now for the single select choice, we're just going to say custom value, and it will be choice question single select. There it is. And then the date will be, now you'll notice that it does not show the date column, because this being a date field, it is filtering the responses, or filtering the data, the dynamic content, to show me only things that it knows for a fact are timestamps. And in this case, if I click see more, then I will see date question, and I can try to plug that in. Now the problem is that it may not actually work. In fact, only once have I ever seen this work, and that was a very long time ago, so something screwy was happening there. So what I normally do is basically use an expression here to format that field. So we'll use the expression format date time. Now it's only a date, but there's no format date expression, it's just format date time. And then we need to give that a timestamp. So again, we will select that date question. And then There are some standard date and time formats. I have a few of the ones, the most common memorized, but you can also use the kind of the ones you would use in Excel for formatting dates and times. So we'll go with month, capital M for month, small d for, actually it needs to be dashes, I believe, and then 4 Y's for a 4-digit year. So we'll click OK. So basically that expression is just saying take that response date and put it in this format just to be sure that it is accepted as a proper date and time. So we can hit save, and once it's done saving, I'll go back over to my form and we'll preview this. We'll say this is short text. Text, and this will be longer text, and just to actually have longer text in there, I'll just paste in that same text over and over again. I'll say choice 2, and then the date question will be December 28th. And I'll hit next, and we'll skip all that other stuff, and I'll submit. And there we go. So now if we go back to our our SharePoint site and look, there is our form response from, you can see that it's filled in, form response from me at this date and time. And yes, that is absolutely, it is currently 11:12 a.m. here on the East Coast of the US. So this is telling me the UTC time of that response, which is fine. Again, if I wanted that to be precise, if I wanted to be local time, I can convert that using an expression or another convert time action. But that's the gist of it. So that's how we get our text fields, our our short text, our long text, our single select choice fields, and our date fields into a SharePoint list. So that is kind of what I wanted to cover today. Next up, and these are probably going to be split out over a couple of videos just to kind of keep the run times reasonable, but we will come back and we'll talk about multi-select choice questions, which is a pretty common, they're very commonly used, but it is a unique enough use case that I wanted to make that a separate video so I can focus on it. And then we'll talk about probably of the remaining ones, the file upload is the most relevant. And I actually have some videos on that already, but I might just link to those, refer you to those, or I might re-record those if things have changed since they were recorded, close to a year ago, if not over a year ago. So we'll talk about all these other use cases or other question types and what they, how and why you might want to record those in a SharePoint list in the next video. So hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, by all means, feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you have any questions, throw those in the comments down below, and I will keep an eye out for you.